I'm very happy to introduce Eli Glazier. It's Glazier, correct? All right. It's a multimodal transportation planner coordinator for the Montgomery County Planning Department, and he's here to talk about walkability from all sorts of angles and perspectives in Montgomery County, and so as a way to celebrate Walktober. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. Thank you for having me today. My name is Eli Glazier, and as Joe said, I'm a transportation planner with the Montgomery County Planning Department. In this role, I review private development and public capital projects and make sure the design of the pedestrian and bicycle space within those projects is done at a high quality. My main job for the past several years has been as project manager for the county's pedestrian master plan. Before I worked at the planning department, I worked for a company called Tool Design Group, which is a firm based in Silver Spring that works across the country creating more walkable, bikeable communities in jurisdictions of all sizes. I've worked in places big and small to make recommendations to develop networks of pedestrian and bike facilities so more people can walk and bike. In this presentation, I'd like to share a little bit about what we've been working on at the planning department and how the recommendations in the pedestrian master plan can help respond to some of the barriers to walkability that we experience in Montgomery County and that are likely issues in the communities where you live and work as well. These are things to think about if you're interested in helping your community become more of a walkable place. The roadmap for today, I'll be talking about what the pedestrian master plan is, why it's important to plan for walkability, how we as Montgomery County are addressing the walkability roadblocks we have experienced, and then there'll be hopefully some time for question and answer at the end so we can talk a little bit more about the situations that are happening in your communities. This plan, the pedestrian master plan, is really the first time Montgomery County is focused specifically on improving the pedestrian experience countywide. The overarching goal of this plan is to make walking and rolling, which means using a mobility device, wheelchair, stroller, etc., more comfortable, more convenient, more accessible for pedestrians of all ages and abilities across the county. I think one of the main ideas we're thinking about is that all trips within a short distance should become viable pedestrian trips, which is to say that not everyone's going to walk that quarter mile to a restaurant or a grocery store or post office, but the infrastructure should really exist and the design of where we live should exist so that that's a viable option for people. There should be sidewalks, there should be safe places to cross the street, things like that. This is a plan that kicked off in September of 2019, and since then we've made a lot of progress. Our public engagement started then, and we traveled around the county listening to people share their pedestrian experiences. And through that process, we identified some common threads that tie pedestrians across the county together. Then we put out an existing conditions report in March of this year that includes a ton of data collection to really understand pedestrian conditions on the ground. Some really unique elements here include a pedestrian level of comfort analysis, which essentially we estimated how comfortable it was to be a pedestrian on every single sidewalk, trail, street crossing location in the county, using things like sidewalk width, how wide the buffer is between the sidewalk and the street, speed limit, etc. From that data, we were able to provide some insights into the areas of the county that are more comfortable for walking and the areas that are less comfortable. We also coordinated very closely with Montgomery County Public Schools on a student travel tally, essentially asking, the goal was to ask every single student, but we got over 73,000 responses to help understand on a school-by-school level, at a grade-by-grade level, how many kids are walking to school, to really help us as a county prioritize increasing the number of students that are walking to school. We did a countywide crash analysis looking at pedestrian crashes from 2015 to 2020, looking at crash trends, the circumstances around those crashes, and comparing pedestrian crashes to all crashes overall. I think an interesting note here, pedestrian crashes make only up about 4% of total crashes, but 27% of the crashes that result in severe injury or fatality. So that's just something to think about. And then for the first time, we also completed a statistically valid countywide survey. We essentially sent to 60,000 randomly selected households a unique survey link that asked them about their pedestrian experience, perceptions of different elements of the environment, how often they walked, where they walked, We ended up with a 4.1% response rate, which led to a very low 2% countywide margin of error. So all of these existing conditions findings paired with the public engagement really laid the groundwork for us to develop recommendations, which we're really just finishing up this month. We're also currently writing the draft plan, the draft pedestrian master plan, and we anticipate starting our planning board and county council edit and adoption process in the next calendar year. So why are we doing all this? What's the history? Why is Montgomery County making an effort to be more walkable? And I think the key element here, the key piece, is just to improve pedestrian safety. The pedestrian master plan was initially called for in the county's first Vision Zero action plan in 2017. If you're not familiar, Vision Zero is an international philosophy that says no number of severe injuries or fatalities are acceptable on our roads. So to achieve Vision Zero will require redesigning our transportation system for increased visibility, slower speeds, more separation between different travel modes, and other changes that prioritize safety over speed. And because pedestrians are the ones disproportionately likely to be killed or severely injured on our roads, creating a plan that centers pedestrian safety and the needs of pedestrians was seen as really important in the county back in 2017 to achieve this. I think we also know that improving walkability and increasing the amount of walking has other benefits, including public health, economic, climate benefits, benefits to the independence of young people, and equity benefits as well. I think there are a lot of people who want to live in walkable places, as the county executive stated earlier, want to locate their business in walkable places, and making it easier and safer to walk improves quality of life for existing residents and really makes places more desirable to be in general. The recommendations in this plan, I think this plan is probably a bit unlike other transportation plans we've done or that you may be familiar with. If you've seen a bicycle master plan or a pedestrian plan somewhere else, they may have identified where bikeways and sidewalks go. This is not necessarily a plan that does that, because we actually already have a document that does. We collaborated over the past couple years with our counterparts at the Montgomery County Department of Transportation on what we call a Complete Streets Design Guide, and that document already lays out how wide sidewalks and other parts of the streetscape should be along different types of streets with different surrounding land uses. So because we already know things like sidewalk width and where crossings should be and things like that, this plan really focuses mostly on higher level, more systemic issues that affect pedestrians in the form of these design, policy, and programming recommendations. In addition, we're advancing a data-driven prioritization to identify where future pedestrian investments should go through the capital improvement program. And we're also recommending so-called pedestrian shortcuts, those shortest path connections between point A and point B that aren't a sidewalk or a trail. One's shown on the screen here. It ends up being over time a dirt path created by pedestrians that are using it to get between point A and point B. And we're including recommendations in this plan so that through public projects and private projects, we can make these more formal, more accessible, make them sidewalks and stairs and other appropriate facilities as well. So in the course of this planning effort, we identified several issues that make it more difficult to walk and reduce the number of walk trips in the county. And we developed recommendations to mitigate some of these issues. All of these issues that I'm about to run through may not be present where you live, but I really bet that some are. And the recommendations we develop may not all be appropriate or practical for your community, but I would let these recommendations act as a jumping off point, really things to consider if you're interested in pivoting your community in a more walkable direction. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll introduce different roadblocks to walkability, principles for overcoming that roadblock, along with some of the recommendations from this master plan that are in line with that principle. There may be other approaches or other recommendations that you may be able to think of about these principles, and it would be really fantastic to hear about those in the question and answer session at the end. The first roadblock is really poor land use. I think the idea that there's nothing to walk to, or the distance between where people live and where they want to walk to is too far, or maybe we're allowing developments to be built that aren't designed to really provide high quality pedestrian connectivity. So in places with land use that doesn't support that pedestrian activity, most of the walking trips are going to be recreational. From our existing conditions report, we found in Montgomery County that in the urban parts of the county, over 11% of weekday weekday trips took place on foot, compared to less than 5% in some of the more exurban and rural parts of the county. Non-recreational walking, so walking for a purpose, to run an errand, to go to the post office, to go to a restaurant, etc., is much more common in the urban parts of the county, I think, which makes intuitive sense given that there tend to be more destinations, more places to walk in the more urban parts of the county. We also found that urban residents take more walking trips than people living in other parts of the county. And I think one of the big reasons for this is that I think transportation planners like myself like to say that the best transportation plan is a land use plan, because the decisions communities make about where to locate land use and at what intensity to allow that land use have a really direct relationship to how people travel to and between land uses. It's much easier to walk, bike, and take transit if more land uses are located close to each other. Fewer walking trips are going to happen if community destinations are further apart. That's just kind of how it is. So how can we do our better to address this roadblock? The first is really to encourage compact development. In this plan, we recommend using the master plan processes that we have for smaller parts of the county to really focus growth on downtowns, town centers, and along our growth corridors, which are places that either already today are very walkable or in the future through transportation investments can become more walkable places. So focusing growth in these areas, and then also co-locating our public buildings, parkland, and commercial areas to create what are called park once opportunities. So places where people may not be able to walk to, or a lot of people may not be able to walk to, but if they can park once and walk between those places, it's much better than having to drive between individual destinations. So those are some of the things we're advancing in terms of compact development. Additionally, just requiring and incentivizing sidewalks be built through private development. So in Montgomery County, we're looking into requiring and incentivizing new developments, not just to build sidewalks internal to their site and to sort of one of the main roads that is adjacent to the site, but to connect to nearby sidewalks and trails that may exist, or be prepared for sidewalks or trails that may be built in the future. And then I think a problem that we have in the county that I'm sure is universal is we don't have a lot of leverage as a planning department or as a planning board to provide pedestrian connections in places that are in developments that already are built, in places that already exist. So a lot of the concerns that we get about pedestrian access and pedestrian safety are in places where there's no project for us to discuss, there's no new development, and there's no real way to compel, obviously, private property owners to make improvements to their own property without that process. So this recommendation is essentially to offer a carrot, to offer some monetary support to homeowners associations, condo associations, and commercial property owners to provide these pedestrian connections. I think over the course of development in Montgomery County, a lot of development has been approved that's been very sort of insular in nature, has sort of been isolated and separated from other parts of the community, and it's created these sort of bubbles where it's really difficult to walk places in the county. So offering monetary support to provide connections that sort of connect neighborhoods across some of these barriers we think is really important. And then lastly in this area, just developing design guidance and policy to ensure that the urban design of buildings is more directly accessible for pedestrians. So this comes up a lot when we're looking at what are called mandatory referral projects for public schools, just making sure public schools and other public buildings are sited in ways that allow safe and direct pedestrian access, so pedestrians don't necessarily have to walk through a parking lot to access the front of the school. Schools are located in places that are walkable, and also working to ensure that public buildings that are being built and renovated, these projects are designing and constructing the bikeways and sidewalks that are along their frontage as recommended in master plans and in the Complete Streets Design Guide that I mentioned. So it's not so much of a challenge for us in Montgomery County to work with private development to ensure that their buildings building a high-quality streetscape, good pedestrian and bicycle facilities. The main issue is actually working with some of the public agencies that do construction in Montgomery County, so our Department of General Services and the public school system, to make sure that we're essentially building high-quality projects that people can access on foot. Another roadblock we face is really systemic traffic safety issues, which are about two main topics, I would say. The first is that the most popular motor vehicles in the country these days are these tall, heavy trucks and SUVs. And while these vehicles may provide their own occupants some sense of safety, they're very dangerous for people outside the vehicle due to how heavy they are and the large blind spots that their design creates. I think over the last 10 years, as these vehicles have gotten more popular, we've seen pedestrian fatalities increase faster than roadway deaths as a whole, so 54% increase for pedestrian fatalities versus 13% for all roadway deaths as a whole. And then in addition to these types of vehicles, speeding and other traffic safety issues are really prevalent in Montgomery County, and I assume across the state, which increases the unpredictability of the transportation system, which dissuades many people from taking pedestrian trips and making those pedestrian trips that do happen a lot more dangerous. So I think what we're trying to do here in Montgomery County, first and foremost, is lead by example, essentially making sure that county vehicles and public agency vehicles are designed in such a way that they're safe for pedestrians, so not buying large SUVs or large trucks if we don't actually need them for a specific purpose. And then also ensuring that there's a recommendation that these same sorts of vehicles should have speed governors installed to ensure that their drivers adhere to the speed limit. Speed governors, which is also something called intelligent speed management, is just making sure that the vehicle, as it's being driven, can exceed the speed limit. So just making sure that as county employees, as public agencies, we're following the rules of the road and that sort of thing. Additionally, we think it's important to sort of educate to help mitigate the effects of these larger vehicles. So I think we recognize that a lot of the issues that exist today around large SUVs and other vehicles with pedestrian visibility issues are not going to be solved at the countywide level. It's going to require state legislation, federal regulation, but working essentially to create some sort of new class of driver's licensing to require vehicles with identified pedestrian safety and visibility issues to require the owners and users of those vehicles to have some more education. And then I think broadly, just improving driver safety education overall by updating the license renewal process to include a brief educational component. So drivers can really be brought up to date on changes to traffic laws, infrastructure, and other things that have happened since the last time they renewed their license, which is not an opportunity that a lot of people have when license renewal happens these days. And then lastly, in Montgomery County, increasing traffic enforcement activities. And I think there are a lot of ways you could possibly do this, but I think we think to allow for more ubiquitous and certain enforcement, the plan recommends increasing the number of automated enforcement locations and also the types of violations that can be addressed in an automated way. So in Montgomery County, we do speed enforcement already. We do red light enforcement to a certain extent. We already do bus enforcement, but starting to think about things like stop sign enforcement. And I know there have been some county council members who've been interested in things like distracted driving and things like that as well. Another big issue is just wide and fast roads. I think, unfortunately, these are streets in Montgomery County that have a lot of pedestrian destinations, but they're also the streets that disproportionately are the site of pedestrian crashes. So in Montgomery County, major highways and controlled major highways, which are our busiest streets, make up only about 5.6% of the total roadway mileage, but 44% of pedestrians killed and severely injured are killed along these streets. I think it's unfortunate that these are the places where the destinations are, but also even if you're not trying to access something on the street, you're probably going to have to cross streets like this in your pedestrian trip to get where you're going. And while I think these statistics are Montgomery County specific, the story is largely the same across the state and across the country. Pedestrians are getting seriously hurt and killed on wide, fast roads that were not really built with their needs in mind. And people who have a choice not to walk along or across these roads are probably driving or not taking these trips altogether. So I think that's really a major concern in Montgomery County. I think the main way we're trying to tackle this is really reimagining these roadways, which may have really minimal sidewalks or no sidewalks at all, as complete streets that provide space for all modes. So the main way we're doing that is to embrace the Complete Streets Design Guide. So as streets are reconstructed, to make sure that we're providing high quality spaces for pedestrians, for bicyclists, for transit, both through public and private development projects. Second, a lot of these busy streets in Montgomery County are state highways. So working with the State Highway Administration to apply their context-driven guidebook to improve the pedestrian experience. This is a guidebook that State Highways put out that encourages the use of more progressive roadway design to better serve pedestrians and non-drivers. So communities across the state can really work with State Highway to apply this guidebook in your community to get higher quality crossings, more dedicated pedestrian spaces, and improve traffic calming along state roadways. And then lastly, there is a plan recommendation to develop an approach to assume county control of state highways in our downtowns and town centers and along our bus rapid transit corridors. I think this primarily is sort of the genesis of this is twofold. The first is that as a county, we would really like more flexibility in design in how these roads are reimagined. And then also, I think there's a basic government accountability piece here. I handle a lot of phone calls and a lot of emails, and I'm sure my Department of Transportation colleagues do as well, where people complain about roads in their communities that they feel are unsafe. And 9 times out of 10, these roads are state roads. And as an employee, I have to say, this is not something that's within my control. I'm going to have to direct you to the State Highway Administration, which is true, but it's not a very satisfying experience for me. It's not satisfying for the resident, and it doesn't really seem like good government to just push people back and forth between different jurisdictions when people really only see the government as being responsible. So really centralizing responsibility for these wide, fast roads in Montgomery County, especially in the most walkable parts of the county, under the County Department of Transportation is one avenue that we're interested in pursuing to reimagine these roads to become more pedestrian friendly. Another roadblock we see in Montgomery County is just traffic signalization in general and the number and quality of pedestrian crossings. Pedestrians tend to have to walk well out of their way to cross at a signalized location in a lot of Montgomery County, and when they do have a signalized location, there's often not enough time to cross the street safely. Traffic signal cycles are so long that if pedestrians are delayed, they may cross against the light, which is obviously a pedestrian safety issue. And then there are some inaccessibility issues with how push buttons are located, so people can't necessarily safely cross. So we have recommendations in this plan to provide more opportunities to cross the street, so to identify additional, essentially, places to put signalized intersections along streets so there are more opportunities to cross. There are some parts of Montgomery County, like Beers Mill Road, if you're familiar, between Rockville and Wheaton, where crossing from one side of the street to the other requires a quarter-mile detour out of your way in each direction to cross the street safely. I'm sure there are similar situations in communities across the state. Additionally, talking about creating standards for the distance between bus stops and the nearest protected crossing, so that if you're boarding or alighting a bus stop, you can safely cross the street to the other side, which is not a situation that exists today in a lot of Montgomery County. Additionally, making it so we can provide more time for pedestrians of all ages and abilities to cross the street. While the most signals in Montgomery County assume pedestrians are walking at 3.5 feet per second, and that's what the time to walk across the street is based on. This really may not be enough time for people who are older, people who are younger, people who have mobility issues. So we recommend lowering the pedestrian walking speed at locations frequented by older pedestrians, by younger pedestrians, and by those with disabilities, and then providing pedestrians in our downtowns and town centers a head start using what's called a leading pedestrian interval to allow a few seconds of a head start for pedestrians at intersections, which allows pedestrians to get into the street, into the crosswalk before right turning or left turning vehicles can cross, which reduces conflicts. And then lastly, in this section, reducing pedestrian delay, making it so you don't have to push a button to cross the street, which will reduce delay for pedestrians, and then reducing pedestrian wait times by developing a policy on essentially reducing the signal cycle lengths. So everyone gets a green light faster, the signal cycles are just shorter, which will reduce delay not just for pedestrians, but for all modes. Another roadblock that we identified is really just reactive investment and maintenance. I think Montgomery County is no exception, but a lot of communities build sidewalks where they're requested rather than where they're needed most. A lot of sidewalks are fixed by request instead of in a proactive way, and many communities don't have priorities for where pedestrian amenities should go, sidewalk standards, or a plan to create a pedestrian network. So the principles here are really to plan ahead, to be effective, and to be equitable. We want to pivot the county's annual sidewalk program, which is where a lot of the sidewalks on residential streets, how those sidewalks are constructed, from a reactive request-driven program to an equitable data-driven process. We also, as I said earlier, are developing a prioritization approach to guide where our pedestrian-related capital improvement program funds are going, so we can make sure that we, with an eye to equity, with an eye towards pedestrian demand, we're making the limited investments we can in pedestrian issues in the areas that we'll see the biggest benefit. And then being proactive in maintenance is also important. We have a recommendation in the plan to really proactively inspect and repair county sidewalks across the entire county and track implementation of that process. So essentially reviewing the sidewalk quality in a different part of the county every year and making improvements based on that review. I think the idea here is that if we're making a lot of minor fixes in a proactive way, it's going to save money in the long run and lead to a higher quality of service for pedestrians than having to make big fixes when sidewalks deteriorate completely. Additionally, vegetation is a big issue in Montgomery County for pedestrian accessibility and then also for driver visibility. So we have a recommendation to audit county and state roadways seasonally for vegetation overgrowth and address any issues that are identified as part of that process. And then lastly, before I wrap up, limited funding, obviously an issue, and a big issue to walkability. I think it's no surprise that many communities across the state and around the country have really underinvested in the pedestrian realm for decades, whether by not building adequate sidewalks along new roadways, not requiring sidewalks within residential development, or not designing intersections to be safe for pedestrians to cross. These historic oversights have really made it costly to provide high quality facilities today because the backlog of what's necessary and required is really so big. In the past year, for instance, Montgomery County DOT has received over 300 requests for new sidewalks, and they've really only been able to meet 28 of them. And if you imagine those requests piling up year after year, there's really a massive backlog in Montgomery County as we try and address these issues. And I think at the same time, communities across the state obviously have other funding priorities like parks and schools and other things that make it difficult to identify additional funding from the current budget to shift towards pedestrian investments, even if people think they are important. So I think what we're saying is if walkability is a priority, then the investment needs to be made. So we tried to think a little bit creatively about some new potential revenue streams to fund projects, including looking into better pricing our parking spaces, looking to some sort of countywide tax to fund pedestrian safety improvements, automated traffic enforcement, which I talked about already, and then the potential to tie vehicle registration fees to funding pedestrian safety issues as well. I think just yesterday on the countywide tax piece, I think there may be obviously some concern about doing something like that, but there's a referendum on the ballot next month in Denver, Colorado to levy a small tax on residents that would build out a complete sidewalk network in the next 9 years in Denver and pay for sidewalk maintenance and repair in perpetuity as well. So I think there may be more funding options on the table than we think if communities can think creatively. So I've said a lot. I'd love to hear from you all, and I really appreciate the invitation to talk about what we're doing and some of the roadblocks that we identified as part of this plan. So thank you. Any questions or thoughts? Yeah, so absolutely. I think there are many recommendations in this plan that I didn't get to talk about, but one of them is about the issue that you identified. Essentially, on some of the busier county roads and state roads. Yeah, oh no, I'm familiar with the area. Traffic engineers may have only provided crosswalks at 3 of the 4 legs of the intersection. So to cross the street in the safest possible way, you would have to cross the entire street the long way. And people don't do that because it doesn't make any sense to do that because you have to catch a bus or whatever. So people put themselves in harm's way. So we have a recommendation in this plan to evaluate those locations and improve and provide that 4th leg crosswalk essentially. I think are there any traffic engineers in the room? No? Oh, fantastic. So the reason that happens is because somebody modeled the intersection movements at those locations and found that if you provided pedestrian time to cross at that location, it would back up the queue of cars trying to turn there, and there would be some sort of traffic issue. So whenever you see a missing crosswalk in your community, it's probably because somebody thought that allowing pedestrians safe space to cross there would have inconvenienced someone for like 10 or 15 seconds. So that's just know that when you see it, that was a choice that somebody made, and yeah, we have a recommendation in the plan to look at those locations and really change that practice.
Sometimes, if you have 2 modes of transportation on each side of the street, even with that additional crosswalk, if a commuter sees the light rail coming by across the street, once the bus comes off on the other side of the street, they're going to try to run across and make sure they can get that light rail for a reason, whether that definitely access or not. It's unsafe. Yep. And it would be great if, I don't know if it exists or not, if those light rail operators, bus operators, somehow wait, somehow for the street light change, because that's called safety. I don't know if